Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, Interim Chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Today's guest is Dr. Matt Binnicker, the co-director of the Clinical Virology Laboratory and the Vice Chair of Practice for the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic. Welcome back, Dr. Binnicker. It's always great to have you with us.
Hey, Dr. Pritt, good to see you again.
So today we're going to be talking about some viruses, as always. And the first one I wanted to talk about was avian influenza. It's definitely been making the headlines over the past few weeks. So can you explain what the current situation is with avian flu?
Yeah, absolutely. It has been making the news. This is a virus that we've actually known about for almost 3 decades. Initially caused an outbreak in birds and humans in China decades ago, and has since caused a few sporadic outbreaks in people, never in large numbers. But there seems to be something different about the current ongoing outbreak that started in about 2020 among wild birds and then poultry farms and backyard bird flocks. To date, there's been over 90 million poultry that have been affected by this recent avian flu strain that's circulating. Thousands of wild birds in all
Wow.
50 states have been identified to be carrying this virus. And kind of troubling, we've started to see some infections in mammalian species and a few crossovers into humans as well.
Yes, and I've been reading about that. I believe there are some things that maybe are making this outbreak a little different, with perhaps some cattle involved as well. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's right. As I mentioned, circulation of avian influenza viruses in wild birds is extremely common. And we've known that this happens again for decades. But what is, I think, a little bit different and troubling is that over the last several years, we've started to see different mammalian species become infected with this avian influenza virus. They usually become exposed by interacting with a sick or dead wild bird or poultry or backyard bird flock. And most recently, we've started to see cases in dairy cattle, which is somewhat unique and new. There's been dairy cattle in 9 different U.S. states detected, and about 51 different dairy cattle herds where avian influenza has been detected in the U.S. over the last few months. So that again is a bit unique and new about this particular avian flu outbreak.
Wow, that is very interesting and I guess a bit concerning. And the question that is probably on everyone's mind now is, can this virus be transmitted from animals to humans?
It can, but so far, this has been a very rare event. Since 2022, there's only been 2 documented infections in a human in the United States. So one in Colorado in 2022, and then most recently this year in Texas. And that individual in Texas became infected, we think, by interacting with an infected dairy cattle. And he presented with only conjunctivitis, so he had redness and swelling of both eyes. He didn't have any other typical flu symptoms, but he was confirmed to be infected with this avian influenza strain. So the short answer is yes, it can happen, but so far it seems to be a very rare event.
Well, that's reassuring. So I guess that's good news for everyone listening and joining us here today is don't panic. He was diagnosed, so there are some testing resources. Can you talk a little bit about what resources are available to test humans for avian flu?
Yeah, so when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, we started out with no diagnostic tools at all. And one of the differences with avian influenza, if it ever becomes a bigger problem in terms of more human cases, we do have influenza tests that fortunately seem to be able to detect this avian influenza strain. So we think that many tests, especially the molecular PCR test that labs use to diagnose routine traditional influenza cases in humans, will be positive if someone is infected with an avian influenza strain. The downside is they won't be able to tell us that it's the avian influenza strain. It will just say positive for influenza. So we have some initial tools, but the Centers for Disease Control does have an FDA-approved avian influenza test that they've started to distribute to state health labs and certain clinical labs, and they're also working with diagnostic test manufacturers to potentially make some more broadly available avian flu tests. So there's some good news behind this story.
Yeah, that is good news, especially that we have tools right off the bat, even if they aren't completely specific. If we have widely circulating influenza and avian flu, at least we hope patients will get a diagnosis.
Correct.
Now, you did mention COVID-19, so I'm going to bring that up as the second virus to talk about today. There's new variants. We've been talking a lot about variants over since the pandemic began back in 2020. So these new variants are called FLiRT variants. Am I getting that right, or do you spell it out? FLiRT.
No, I think it's being referred to as
FLiRT.
FLiRT. Yeah.
Okay. So what are these mutations, and what do we know about them?
Yeah, so as we've known now for close to 4 years, the virus that causes COVID-19 continues to mutate over time. And what happens is that as the virus infects people and mutates, certain variants of the virus gain a competitive advantage. It's able to infect someone more efficiently. It's able to evade the immune response. And so as certain viruses gain those capabilities, they take over from past variants of the virus. And that's what's happening here with this
Okay.
latest round of FLiRT variants. They're called FLiRT because of the amino acid changes in the spike protein. So that's the protein that sticks off the surface of the virus, and the amino acid F has changed to L, and the amino acid
Okay.
R has changed to T. In these specific regions of the spike protein, a few of the mutations allow the virus to evade the antibody response from prior infection or vaccination. One of the other mutations allows it to bind to a cell receptor more efficiently. So that's why this virus is taking over as a more predominant virus, is it's able to escape the immune response and bind the host cell better.
So even if you've had COVID before, you could get it again with
Yeah,
its new
we
variant.
think that if you've had COVID, I would say in the last 3 or 4 months, the ancestor to these new viruses is close enough where your immune system should have generated a pretty good response and maybe protect. But if you were vaccinated or infected greater than 6 months ago, we think that the immune response is probably not going to be strong enough to prevent you from being infected. You're probably going to have less severe symptoms than you might have if you hadn't been vaccinated or infected, but chances are you could probably still be reinfected with one of these newer variants.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. So, do we have any information then on what we think the new variants will do this summer and how it might impact public health?
Yeah, we think that we'll probably see a rise in cases over the summer months. That's been pretty consistent throughout the
Okay.
last 3 to 4 years. But what I'm really watching are the fall and winter months. That's when we typically see the highest rates of respiratory infections, including COVID. And so I know that the WHO and the CDC are working on reformulations of the vaccine, and hoping soon to lock down which particular strain is included in those vaccines. And I'm sure they'll be weighing this most recent circulating variant into their decisions about the vaccine formulation for November of 2024.
Well, thank you, Dr. Binnicker. So, we have the FLiRT variants and COVID-19, maybe some avian influenza. I'm hearing that there's no need to panic at this point, but just stay abreast of the news and find out if there's going to be more information about vaccines later this year.
Yeah, that's right. We've learned a lot, and I say continue to use those measures that we've talked about for the last few years. When it comes to avian flu, if you happen to have a backyard bird flock or work in a poultry farm, if you interact with a sick or a dead bird, we're recommending to wear a mask, an N95 mask, and eye protection and gloves, and call your state or local public health facility and notify them if you have any sick or dying birds, especially if you own a backyard bird flock. And then with COVID, when the new vaccine formulations come out, get the vaccine, because that will offer the most updated vaccine to generate a more specific immune response.
That's great advice. Thanks, Dr. Binnicker. Well, it's always a pleasure having you on, and I'm sure we'll have more things to talk about in the near future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back on.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.